To be presented by Bob Weller, Vice President for Spectrum Policy with the NAB. Prior to joining NAB in 2014, Bob served in a number of technical and management roles at FCC as an engineering consultant to the telecommunications industry. During his 15 years at the FCC, Bob was Chief of Technical Analysis in the Office of Engineering and Technology and was Director of the Denver Field Office. He began at a station in the San Francisco Bay Area and served as president of the AFCCE and director of the IEEE Broadcast Technology Society. Bob has a master's degree in electromagnetics and is a registered PE in California and Colorado. Bob is the NAB's point person on the Spectrum Repack, and we're pleased to have him here today to provide an update, as well as information about the FCC's proposal to repurpose the C-band satellite spectrum for wireless use. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Mark. Joe's talk was really interesting. A number of years ago, I saw Vint Cerf speak. This is back when he was with Research in Motion. Might have to turn up my mic a little bit. And he said something that I'll always remember. He's one of the fathers of the Internet Protocol, and he said, IP here, IP there, IP on everything. And he was right. The Internet Protocol is becoming tremendously important in the broadcast world. It's the way that we can get across non-broadcast to, or broadcast to non-broadcast networks. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to share some important information. As Mark said, I'm Vice President for Spectrum Policy at NAB. I'm not in the technology department. David Lair, who spoke in the last session next door, is in that department. I'm actually in the legal department. So it's me and 12 attorneys right now. So we have a staff meeting once a week. And during the first 55 minutes of the staff meeting, while the attorneys are doing the round robin, I have no idea what they're talking about. It's usually about performance tax and things like that. And then I talk for 5 minutes and you can just see their eyes glaze over. So it's nice to talk to a friendly and understanding audience this morning. Every day, Americans turn to their local radio and TV stations to provide them with news, emergency updates, weather, sports, and entertainment that they value. Unfortunately, those who have the ability to shape broadcasting's future, our federal regulators and legislators, don't always understand our immense worth, particularly local stations' vital role in our communities, how you're involved with innovating to better serve listeners and viewers. And Spectrum has become a form of currency in Washington, and there's a push underway to transfer wealth from a variety of Spectrum holders, including broadcasters, to wireless companies for something called 5G. This is just the latest example of eternal recurrence that is being justified by a catchphrase. First it was the Spectrum crunch, then it was the Spectrum crisis, and we can all take bets on what the next catchphrase is going to be, the Spectrum crossroads, and the Spectrum calamity, and the Spectrum catastrophe, or the Spectrum cataclysm. It's coming. I'll get to the technical part of the presentation, but just I do want to emphasize the importance of you, those of you that work at radio and TV stations, reaching out to your representatives in Congress when they're at home in their districts to tell them how important broadcasting is, particularly the fact that you get programming from networks and from the field using Spectrum. You relay programming from the studio to the transmitter using Spectrum. You relay broadcasts are delivered to the public for free using Spectrum. The point to emphasize is Spectrum is vital to broadcasters. The internet is not an alternative. Cellular is not an alternative. Broadcasters require spectrum to keep the free press alive. And my job at NAB is to protect broadcaster spectrum for whatever you want to use it for. And I do my best to do that, but it's much more impactful to your legislators if you can explain why broadcasters can't and consumers shouldn't rely on the internet and Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile or whatever to fulfill our public service responsibilities. So moving to technology, I'd like to talk about an issue affecting both radio and TV, and that's C-band. Broadcasters rely on satellites for distribution and content every day. Much or most of that is done using C-band. American Cable Association filed some comments recently that indicated there were over 2,000 video networks, video broadcast networks that are carried over C-band. I was born in 1961. In 1962, Telstar was launched and relayed the first video broadcast. It's been the backbone for content distribution ever since. C-band has some considerable advantages over other satellite bands like Ku band. A major one is rain fade. Maybe that's less important in Ohio, but in places like Florida and New Mexico, stations would lose their feeds pretty frequently if they were stuck on Ku band, and just ask any DirecTV or Dish viewer about that. A lot of legislators and regulators in Washington are convinced that 5G is the most important thing in the universe right now. And so the FCC is very motivated to transfer at least a portion of the C-band to mobile use. I'm kind of a Beltway insider, and I deal with Washington jargon a lot, so let me just explain the mechanism that the FCC commonly uses to make changes like this. It's commonly called the inquiry rulemaking order process, and it's based on a law called the Administrative Procedures Act. The first part is the notice of inquiry. It's designed to gauge interest in a new service or a change in spectrum use. And there was a notice of inquiry released last year in August of 2017 that considered what the FCC now calls mid-band. And mid-band goes from 3.7 to 24 gigahertz. That's a huge amount of spectrum, and it covers a lot of spectrum that broadcasters use, including C-band, 6.5 gigahertz, 7 gigahertz, 13 gigahertz, 18 gigahertz, and all of that spectrum is on the table right now. But the strongest interest was in C-band, so the FCC very quickly broke off 3.7 to 4.2 from that inquiry proceeding and moved to the second step, which is the notice of proposed rulemaking. The comment period on that is closed, but there's now a reply comment period. But this notice of proposed rulemaking for C-band was very non-specific. It asked a huge number of questions. How much spectrum should be repurposed for mobile? Should it be repurposed for other services like, WISPs or internet? Who pays for the spectrum? How do you accommodate user disruptions? Anyway, a lot of questions. Despite the large number of questions, this is a political freight train, and it's likely to move very quickly. The next step would be an order, report and order, or more likely, I think, a series of orders that respond to each of those major decision points that I mentioned. But I'd expect something, at least the first order, maybe the first quarter of next year. So this is coming, and it's coming soon. On the screen here is a map of C-band satellite deployments. C-band was widely shared for many years between terrestrial, like AT&T long lines and MCI and Western Union, terrestrial circuits shared with satellite. But the number of terrestrial circuits has dropped tremendously. So satellite right now is the principal use of this spectrum. When the FCC opened the notice of proposed rulemaking, they indicated there were about 4,700 C-band earth stations, and therefore the band is underutilized. And okay, if you look at that number, I guess I might tend to agree. Well, back in the 1980s, the FCC eliminated the requirement for earth stations to register. So that transferred the risk of interference, from the FCC and the terrestrial landlines people to the earth station operator. And as I said, since the number of terrestrial microwave links has been dropping, you might be willing to take that risk. What's the point of spending $1,500 or $2,000 when the risk of interference is small and getting smaller? Well, now registration has become very important. If the FCC authorizes 5G at C-band, your earth station may just stop working. We expect there will be a reimbursement fund, much like the incentive auction reimbursement fund. But it may be that only registered earth stations would be eligible to draw from it. So if you're in a remote area and your best option to restore service is to put in a fiber link, but the nearest fiber is 15 miles away, that's millions of dollars. If your earth station is registered, that expense should be covered or could be covered. NAB did its best to try and reduce the cost for registration. We did our best to try and get the word out, but at this point, the registration window is closed. It closed the end of October, so it may be too late. So before the FCC, yes.
Hey, how come these people that own these satellites aren't howling about this? I mean, these people put a lot of money in putting this whole system in place. It's not just the earth station people who are going to lose money on this.
Yep, the satellite companies, you mean?
Yeah, how come they aren't going crazy about this? They're going to lose everything, aren't they?
Potentially, they could, but they're going to get a huge amount of cash if they lost access to the band. But I don't think that's where they're focused. They're focused on some sort of division between mobile and satellite that would allow them to keep their recurring income, allow them to keep their existing users, but just do that in less spectrum. And there are some technical ways to do that. There are still video streams running MPEG-2. Those could be upgraded. There are unfilled satellite slots, so more satellites could be launched. I mean, there's some ways to do this.
So they can repurpose some of these things to be able to use them anyway then, huh?
That's what they tell us. That's what they would like us to believe. We're asking a lot of questions about exactly how that will work.
SES ended up saying that they would pay the $400 and some registration fee.
Yes.
So they absolutely stepped up and made that available to people that didn't have that money.
Yeah.
So that's the one big player that said, hey, we're going to put our money where our mouth is. We're going to encourage you small guys here or whoever that we're going to pay for you to register.
Yeah, initially the SES set aside $1 million to cover those registration fees, and that got eaten up in a matter of weeks, somewhere over here. But they set aside additional money. So I think, well, I'll just leave it at that. As I said, when the notice of proposed rulemaking came out, there were about 4,700 earth stations registered. The FCC typically receives around 60 or 70 registrations for new earth stations per year. When the FCC announced that stations had a limited amount of time to register and that kind of 5G was coming, that number jumped to 60 or 70 registrations per week. And then once networks like Westwood One started reaching out to their customers directly, that number jumped to over 1,000 applications per week. So there's something like 16,500 registered earth stations at this point. Even so, there are a lot of downlinks that are going to get missed, and I guess part of my job is to advocate for some way of protecting those earth stations that either didn't get the word or for whatever didn't register. So what's the impact of sharing with terrestrial? There have been lots of technical studies by the ITU and others to demonstrate that co-frequency sharing between satellite and terrestrial is really challenging. Some of the separation distances that are required are on this chart. These are worst case, so the terrestrial and the satellite dish are kind of pointed at each other, but the satellite dish is allowed to move in the elevation plane. Directional antennas and other techniques can help, but you're dealing with really weak signals from 22,000 miles away. I don't have to explain that to you. Propagation models that the 5G industry use to illustrate that sharing is possible, those are 2D models. And when you're dealing with really weak signals, things like reflections off of buildings and off of terrain can be significant. I haven't heard of anybody who's addressing that issue. So a couple of other C-band issues. In the notice of proposed rulemaking, the FCC proposed eliminating full band, full arc licensing. Broadcasting is obviously dynamic. This includes our use of satellites. We need to be able to access any satellite, any transponder on very short notice. NAB has opposed the elimination of that flexibility. A major reason for proposing to eliminate full band, full arc licensing is to accommodate the other part of this notice of proposed rulemaking that I haven't really talked about, and that's something called point to multi-point overlay. This is a proposal that's being pushed by the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, WISPA, to open up C-band, the part that's not given over to 5G, to provide internet service. We think that's going to be, frankly, a disaster. So we're strongly opposed to that. But the real motivation behind eliminating full band, full arc licensing is to allow for this co-frequency overlay with wireless internet. Okay, so moving on from C-band, I'd like to touch on a couple of spectrum items that are mostly of interest to TV, but if you're with radio, it's still going to be of some interest. The repack. A number of years ago, NAB, when the incentive auction and National Broadband Plan were still in the formative stages, NAB suggested that the cost of repacking TV stations would be about $3 billion. So Congress allocated a bit more than half of that, $1.75 billion. And once the FCC started receiving cost estimates, it became apparent that NAB's original estimate was at least closer to being correct. Getting additional money out of Congress is never easy, and in the current Congress and the previous Congress, even tougher. Nonetheless, broadcasters were able to secure an additional $1 billion over 2 years to help ensure viewers and listeners don't lose access to stations. So the FCC approved a rulemaking related to this $1 billion allocation. We are closely following that proceeding. I'll just leave it at that. But if the repack timetable holds, the 36, 39 months, which frankly I don't think it will, at least the money part should not be a problem. I want to jump in with a little information about NAB's consumer outreach program, TV Answers. We're trying to help consumers first by alerting them when stations in their market are moving channels, and second, assisting viewers that experience reception problems associated with the repack. It turns out I get a lot of those calls and emails, and they're really, really time-consuming to figure out. So the fewer of those calls that I get, the more time I have to spend on kind of broader issues. But to be useful, NAB has to have current information and accurate information on when stations are changing channel. So if your station is transition in phase 1 or phase 2, please let us know when, exactly what date. Also, if you're carried on translators, notifying us of your translator's channel change date, if there is one. You know, maybe if you're lucky, your translator doesn't have to change channel. That's very important because consumers don't know what channel they're watching. They just, you know, they see the main brand, and that's all they see. So where are we in the repack? The phase 1 test period's underway. Ends at the end of this month. There's 99 transmitters changing during phase 1, including 3 stations moving to channel 14, which we have some particular concerns about. We're starting already to see slippage in the repack timeline. If you look at the total number of stations in phase 0, so the early movers, and in phase 1, it's 153 stations. About 120 of those will change by the end of November, but about 34 of them, and that's a substantial fraction, are kind of up in the air at this point. Fortunately, phase 1 doesn't have a lot of interference dependencies, so-called link stations. So if a station misses the deadline, it might cause T-Mobile some heartache, but it shouldn't result in interference. However, moving on from phase 1 to phase 2, we start seeing stations with a lot of dependencies. Stations missing deadlines are what Donald Rumsfeld might have called known unknowns. We knew 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago, some stations are going to miss their deadlines. That's just the way it is. But we didn't know why. Now we know why. It has to do with the small number of tower crews. Once they've rigged to do work at a site and there's a weather delay or something like that, it doesn't make sense for them to take it all down and move on and then come back later. They just wait it out. Some crews have been waiting it out for 2 months. Weather, torrential rains in Missouri and Texas and other places, Hurricane Michael, on-site failures, line burn-ups, repack gear like Joe showed that gets, the filters that get dropped in transit, low power TV and translator stations that are pulling resources, permitting problems, unexpected structural problems. You guys can probably tell me, give me some more examples. There are very few of those specific problems that we could have predicted 3 years ago, but the range of problems was certainly predictable, and the 39-month repack, that schedule, I don't think is likely to hold. Here's a list of stations in Ohio that are in the current phase and the next phase, and I really can't say more than that. I don't know any particular details. I mentioned TV Answers a moment ago, not only for consumers. There's a checklist on there for broadcasters. There's PSAs by Dr. Phil and Alex Trebek and others. So I'm sure your PD hopefully is aware of that. I mentioned Congress made an additional $1 billion available in supplemental funding. A significant part of that is to overcome the shortfall in funding just for full power stations, but at least $150 million of that $1 billion is earmarked for low power TV and TV translator stations. Excuse me. We expect the reimbursement process for translators and low power TV is going to be pretty similar to full power, although the National Translator Association asked for a streamlined reimbursement process for low cost channel changes, those of $31,000 or less, and NAB supports that idea. There's a couple of carve-outs that are of concern to us, that low power translator stations that have to make changes that don't involve a channel change. So a station where repacks around it cause an interference problem, maybe they just have to change their antenna, or maybe they have to change to a different site to clear the interference. Those right now are not eligible for reimbursement. So if that's a significant problem, I guess I'd like to hear about that. Okay, the next big thing, besides C-band, the other band that's being targeted right now is what the FCC calls 6 gigahertz, 5925 to 7125. So that includes our 6.5 E&G spectrum and our 7 gigahertz BAS spectrum. And the what's commonly called FANG, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, plus some others. The FANG has been at the FCC pushing them to reallocate this entire, 1,200 megahertz for Wi-Fi, not reallocate, but just allow Wi-Fi as an overlay, a permitted use in that spectrum. The FCC, for its part, has recognized that broadcasters use 6.5 and 7 gigahertz in mobile environments with E&G and things like that. So they said, no problem, we'll just limit the Wi-Fi uses to indoors. Well, how do you enforce that? Well, if the device has a plug, then it can only be used indoors. Sometimes I wonder about the people working at my former employer. Anyway, we emphasize that even if that were true, there's the Vislink people in the exhibition hall there have camera back type operations at 6.5 and 7 those are used inside, courtside and on the ice and in lots of situations like that. If you have an ENG shot that's looking over a neighborhood or something, and somebody happens to have a picture window that's facing the receive site, that's going to be a problem. The power levels used at ENG are not that great, and they're talking about allowing 4 watts for these Wi-Fi type operations. So we've been in meeting with FCC staff. We got a few additional questions added to the draft notice of proposed rulemaking to specifically ask about how broadcasters are using this spectrum. We've met with the commissioners also to emphasize that this is important, but it's very much a threat. White spaces. So a UK firm, we were kind of hoping white spaces was dead. At least I was hoping that. The initial group of white space database administrators, their authorization from the FCC was good for 5 years, and none of them renewed. And the number of devices that were authorized was like 400 or something like that. So we were kind of hoping it was dead. But a UK firm called Nominet has applied to the FCC to be a white space database administrator. They went through their 45-day testing period. We took a look at their database. We found, just looking at it in a very superficial way, we found problems. We told the FCC we thought that would be enough to, force them to go back and do a more thorough review. Nope, they authorized Nominet as a database. So we hired a consulting engineering firm to take a more thorough look at what Nominet was doing, and they found hundreds of incorrect station records that would result in a white space device being authorized to operate on your TV channel. So we've asked the commissioners to please reconsider the authorization of Nominet and kind of their thinking about it at this point. I think we're likely to go in next week and kind of plead our case in person. But meanwhile, NAB has purchased a couple of white space type devices over the years. Those are now doorstops. They don't work because they're only authorized to work with a particular database operator. One was Google and the other one was Spectrum Bridge. And both those companies are no longer in business, or at least no longer providing the white space service, but it's not dead yet. Okay, so some radio issues, also of interest to TV, I think. I already mentioned the low power TV and translator reimbursement fund of at least $150 million. There's also at least $50 million earmarked for FM and FM translator stations that are impacted by TV stations that are being repacked. NAB conducted we hired Doug Vernier to do a study for us, just identify any FM stations that are on the same tower as a TV station that's being repacked, or close enough to that tower where the RF energy from the FM station could impact workers that are doing work on the TV station's tower. And there were 600 or 700 FM stations. We didn't actually look at translators, but 600 or 700 FM stations in that category. So the point is that there are a significant number of FM stations that could potentially be have to significantly reduce power or shut down so that work can be done on the repacking TV stations. The FCC came up with this idea that if you're only off the air from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., even if that's every day for a year, we're not going to reimburse you anything as far as being able to construct an auxiliary facility or something like that. But if you're off the air during the day part, up to 10 days, we'll reimburse you 50% of your costs. Anyway, they came up with this graduated schedule. That didn't make any sense to us, because I mean, if you have to build an auxiliary facility, you have to pay 100% of the cost. You don't. It's not like you can give it back and get credit. So we've asked them to. I think there'll be a minimal off-air threshold. We've suggested, I think, 1 a.m. to or midnight to 5 a.m. or something like that for no more than 5 nights. But anything beyond that, 100% reimbursement. So the FCC has now published a catalog of potential expenses for both low power and TV and FM station reimbursements. I've talked to some consulting engineers, I've talked to some manufacturers. It looks like the costs are pretty much in line with what you might expect in reality. But if you have particular concerns, please let me know. Almost done. Here's a similar list of Ohio FM stations that are potentially affected by the repack. The study that we commissioned that I mentioned a moment ago is limited by the accuracy of the FCC's database, which sometimes is not very good. So if you're not on this list, you still may be affected. If you are on this list, you may not be affected, but at least here's a rough indication. I think that's it. Again, it's important to communicate with your legislators about what you do to serve your local communities. Honestly, I believe there's no higher and better use of spectrum than the service that broadcasters provide serving diverse audiences for free. Broadcast signals are always available with an antenna. Broadcast content is consistently the most highly rated, most highly watched, most highly listened to. And despite all the competition for our spectrum, no one but local broadcasters provides these things for free. Everybody wants access to our content, everybody wants access to our spectrum, but nobody is willing to take on our public service commitment. And I think I have a couple moments for questions, like 2 minutes. Wow, okay.
Dish and its subsidiary hidden companies purchased a lot of spectrum that the station here up. But there's complaints, I don't know, from NAB about them stockpiling spectrum that they're not going to use. Where does that fit into all of this? We need more spectrum. We're not using what we bought.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. The question is, Dish has purchased a fair amount of spectrum over the years and has basically been warehousing it. They are rapidly running out of time because that spectrum has use by dates like a milk carton or something like that, and Dish is running up against those dates at this point. Their latest proposal is to use their spectrum for Internet of Things, but it's been very non-specific, and for the most part, NAB and broadcasters have kind of stayed away from it, but there are others that are accusing them of abusing the system. But you're right. If we talk about a spectrum crunch or a spectrum calamity, you really need to consider the spectrum that has been obligated or allocated for 5G type uses, but is just, sitting in the shrink wrap somewhere.
In regards to the C-band proceeding, is it likely that we're going to get stuck in a repack there where they're going to compress everything to one end of the band or the other and then let the wireless people have the opposite end?
Yes, so the question is C-band likely to be repacked? And I think the answer is yes. What has happened in Europe is at least the bottom part of the C-band has already been given over to Mobile, or there are auctions ongoing. I think that's going to be the model for here. The lower limit is probably 100 megahertz, so 3.7 to 3.8. Just last week, the C-band Alliance, which is SES, Intelsat, Eutelsat, and Telesat, have put 200 megahertz on the table, up to 200 megahertz. So if that doesn't change, it would be 40%. The wireless operators, for their part, have indicated they would like to have 80 to 100 megahertz each. So if there are 4 wireless operators, do the math. But what you don't, like Mick Jagger said, you can't always get what you want. Okay, lunch.